The shovel blade struck a rock hidden in the hardpan, sending a dull, jarring vibration up the handle that Clara Whitmore felt in her teeth. It was the only sound in the valley, sharper than the wind that stripped the dead grass on the ridge, louder than the muttered prayers of the Reverend Milds. Thomas was gone. The pine box looked too small to hold a man who had once filled the doorway of their cabin, blocking out the sun with a laugh that shook the dust from the rafters. Now he was just weight and silence, lowered into a hole that looked like a wound in the earth. The mourners were few. 3 families from the neighboring claims stood with their hats pressed to their chests, eyes fixed on the horizon as if expecting a storm. They did not look at Clara. In this part of the territory, bad luck was treated like a contagion. If you stood too close to a woman who had lost her husband and her crop in the same season, the misfortune might jump the fence line. Reverend Milds closed his Bible with a snap that signaled he was eager to get back to a warm stove. Ashes to ashes, he had said. But the ground here was not ash. It was granite and grit, frozen solid by a November chill that had arrived 2 weeks early. Clara threw the first handful of dirt. It rattled on the wood like sleet. She did not cry. Her tears had dried up 3 days ago, replaced by a hollow, ringing silence in her chest that felt dangerously like panic. By the time the grave was filled, the sun was a pale coin dipping behind the western peaks. The neighbors muttered their condolences without stopping, retreating to their wagons. Clara stood alone by the fresh mound, the wind whipping the hem of her black dress, turning her skin raw. A buggy rattled up the track, the horse blowing hard. Clara did not turn. She knew the sound of those wheels. Silas Prentice climbed down, clutching a leather satchel to his chest as he navigated the uneven ground. Behind him walked Deputy Miller, a man with a low hat brim and a habit of chewing on a toothpick while he delivered bad news. "Mrs. Whitmore," Silas called out, his voice thin against the wind. "My deepest sympathies. Truly, a tragedy." Clara wiped her hands on her apron, staring at the lawyer. Silas Prentice was a man made of soft edges in a hard country, and she had never trusted him. "What do you want, Silas?" she asked. "My husband is not cold in the ground 10 minutes. It is a matter of urgency," Silas said, stepping close enough that she could smell the stale tobacco on his coat. He glanced at the fresh grave, then back to her, his eyes shifting. "We have been reviewing the county filings. There are irregularities. Clara, serious irregularities regarding the deed to this claim." Clara felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her lightheaded. "Thomas filed that deed 5 years ago. We proved up on this land. We built the house. We ran the fence." "Technically," Silas said, drawing a sheaf of papers from his bag, "the survey lines were drawn in error, and there is a lien against the property. An unpaid debt Thomas incurred." "Lien?" Clara stepped forward, her anger momentarily eclipsing her grief. "Thomas owed no man money. We paid for everything in cash or trade." The deputy shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking. "Now, Mrs. Whitmore, don't get hysterical." "I am not hysterical," Clara said, her voice shaking not with tears but with fury. "I am telling you that my husband was an honest man. Show me this debt." Silas held the paper out but did not let her take it. The handwriting was cramped, the signature at the bottom a smudge of ink that looked vaguely like Thomas's name, but lacked the sharp slant he used when he was proud of something. "It is dated 3 months ago," Silas said smoothly. "A loan from the Double Bar outfit, for improvements that were never made. By the terms of the agreement, default on repayment transfers the title to the creditor immediately upon the death of the borrower. The Double Bar, the massive cattle operation that had been swallowing up the valley, acre by bloody acre. Thomas never borrowed from them. Clara said he hated them. He told me they were pressuring him to sell, that they were cutting our fences." "You are upset," Silas said, tucking the paper away. "It is understandable. Grief clouds the memory, but the law is the law. Clara, you have 30 days to vacate the premises. The Double Bar has been generous enough to allow you time to gather your personal effects. 30 days? Clara looked at the house, the smoke curling from the chimney. the only home she had left. "It is winter. Silas, I am just the messenger," the lawyer said, though his mouth twitched with something that looked like satisfaction. The deputy touched the brim of his hat. "Best not to make a fuss, ma'am," Miller said. "A widow alone." Well, people talk when a woman gets difficult. It makes them wonder if she has something to hide. They left her there, standing between the fresh grave and the house that was no longer hers. The wind howled through the canyon, sounding like 1,000 wolves descending on a carcass. The town of Oakhaven was not named for the trees, which were scarce, but for a memory of a greener place brought west by settlers who had found only sagebrush and stone. 2 weeks after the funeral, Clara walked down the boardwalk, the woods slippery with morning frost. She kept her head high, but she could feel the eyes on her. The town had changed since Thomas died. Before, she was the rancher's wife, a woman who bought flour and calico and paid on time. Now, she was a loose thread in the fabric of the community, a danger. She entered Henderson's Mercantile, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully. The warmth of the stove hit her, smelling of coffee and dry goods. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, weighing nails for a customer. He looked up, saw her, and his smile vanished. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson," Clara said, placing her basket on the counter. "I need a sack of flour, 5 pounds of beans, and a tin of lard." Henderson cleared his throat, wiping his hands on his apron. He did not look her in the eye. "I'm afraid I cannot help you today, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara paused. "I have the money, Mr. Henderson. I'm not asking for credit. It is not that," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "It is just, supply is low. The freight wagons are late." She looked at the shelves behind him. They were fully stocked. The sack of flour sat right there, the white cotton bright in the gloom. "You have flour right there," Clara said slowly. "That is spoken for." Henderson lied, his face flushing red. "Look, Clara, I do not want any trouble. The Double Bar boys, they do a lot of business here. They made it clear that, well, that anyone helping you drag out this legal mess might find their own credit drying up." Clara stared at him. He had known Thomas for 10 years. He had eaten at their table. "You are a coward, Mr. Henderson," she said softly. She turned to leave, her basket empty. As she passed the group of men gathered by the stove, the conversation stopped. She heard the word widow whispered, followed by a low laugh. "Asking for trouble," one man muttered. Clara stepped back out into the cold, her stomach tightening with hunger. She had enough food for maybe 3 days. The woodpile was low, and every night, the wind seemed to find new cracks in the cabin walls. She walked to the post office, her last hope. She had written to her sister in Ohio, begging for a loan, for a ticket home, for anything. The postmaster shook his head before she even reached the window. "Nothing today, Mrs. Whitmore." Clara leaned against the wall, fighting the urge to slide down to the floor. She could not go back to Ohio. She could not stay here. She was trapped in a box canyon with the walls closing in. Her eyes drifted to the tack board by the door, covered in wanted posters and cattle notices. A small, hand-scrawled card fluttered at the bottom, pinned by a rusty nail. "Help wanted. Barrett Ranch. General labor, cooking, mending. No drunks, no shirkers. Inquire at the ranch. E. Barrett. Barrett." She knew the name. Everyone did. Eli Barrett ran a place 20 miles out, up in the high country where the timber grew thick and the snow drifted 10 feet deep. He was a ghost story in Oakhaven. They said he was violent, that he'd killed a man in Abilene, that he lived like a savage. They said no decent woman would go near his land. Clara looked at the empty street. She looked at the lawyer's office across the way, where Silas Prentice sat spinning his web. She thought of Thomas, and the night before he died, he had been pacing the floor, agitated. "The numbers do not add up. Clara," he had said, "they are moving cattle that do not exist on the manifest. And I saw him again today, that stranger at the fence line, watching." Thomas had known something, and they had killed him for it. She was sure of it now. A heart attack. The doctor had said, but Thomas's heart was as strong as an ox. If she left, if she ran back east, the double bar won. They took the land, they buried the truth, and Thomas became just another failure in a land full of them. Clara reached out and tore the card from the wall. The ride to the Barrett Ranch was a punishment. Clara rode Thomas's mare, Bess, the only animal the bank had not yet come to claim. The road dissolved into a rutted track 5 miles out of town, winding up into the foothills where the scrub oak gave way to pine. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against her chest. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, heavy with unfallen snow. Crows circled overhead, calling out to one another, waiting for something to fall. Clara wore every piece of clothing she owned, 2 petticoats, a wool dress, Thomas's heavy coat, and a scarf wrapped 3 times around her face. But the cold found her bones. Her fingers were stiff inside her gloves, clutching the reins until her knuckles turned white. The landscape here was different. It was violent country. Jagged ridges of black rock jutted up from the earth like broken teeth. The grass was brittle, snapping under the horses' hooves. There was no softness here, no place to rest. It took 6 hours to reach the gate. It was a simple structure of lodgepole pine, hung with a sign that had been scoured blank by the weather. Beyond it, the ranch sprawled in a shallow valley protected by a rim of granite. The barn was massive, the corral fences high and sturdy. The main house was low and brooding, built of dark logs, with smoke pumping furiously from 2 chimneys. Clara rode into the yard. A dog barked, a harsh, chopping sound, and a man emerged from the barn. He was tall, wearing a canvas coat stained with grease and mud. His hat was pulled low, shading eyes that were dark and unsmiling. He did not wave. He did not offer a greeting. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, watching her approach with the stillness of a predator deciding if the prey was worth the chase. This was Eli Barrett. Clara reined Bess in and slid from the saddle. Her legs were so numb she almost collapsed when her boots hit the frozen mud. She caught herself on the stirrup leather, forcing herself to stand straight. "Mr. Barrett?" she asked. Her voice cracked. She had not spoken in hours. He looked her over, his gaze traveling from her mud-spattered hem to her wind-burned face. He did not look impressed. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was deep, gravelly, sounding like it wasn't used much. "I am Clara Whitmore. I saw your card in town." Eli Barrett scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "You are the widow, Whitmore's wife." "I am," Clara said, "and I'm here about the job." He turned his head and spit into the dirt. "Go home, Mrs. Whitmore. This is a working ranch, not a charity ward. I need a hand, not a guest." "I am not a guest," Clara said, stepping forward. The anger she had felt at the lawyer sparked again, warming her blood. "I can work. I can cook. I can mend tack. I can ride." Eli looked at her hands. They were small, the gloves worn thin. "You ever hauled water from a creek when the ice is 4 inches thick?" he asked. "You ever held a calf down while it is being branded? You ever cooked for 10 men who have not seen a bath in a month?" "I can learn," Clara said. Eli shook his head. "I do not have time to teach you, and I do not need the trouble you bring. I heard about the deed. I heard about the double bar. You are a lightning rod, lady. I do not want the storm." Clara walked up to him. She was a foot shorter than him, but she did not back down. "I need the wages. Mr. Barrett, I have 30 days before they throw me off my land. I need to eat, and I will work harder than any man you have because I have no other choice." Eli stared at her. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds. He was searching for fear. She realized. He was looking for the moment she would break. She held his gaze. She thought of Thomas in the cold ground. She thought of the smirk on the deputy's face. "I will not bring my trouble to your gate," she said. "I just want to work." Eli stood silent for a long moment. The wind whistled through the corral slats. "Finally," he sighed, a sound of resignation. "Bunkhouse is full," he said abruptly. "There is a tack room off the back of the main house. It has a stove. You can sleep there." Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Thank you. $7 a month and keep," Eli said, turning back toward the barn. "Meals are at 5 in the morning and 6 at night. You cook them. You clean up. In between, you mend whatever is broken. And on this ranch, everything is broken." He stopped and looked back at her. "And Mrs. Whitmore, yes? No widow stories. No crying in the kitchen. No asking for pity. The men will not give it, and neither will I." "I understand," Clara said. The first week was a blur of exhaustion. Clara woke before the sun, the air in the tack room so cold that the water in the pitcher had a skin of ice. She lit the stove in the main kitchen, her breath clouding in the dim light, frying bacon and baking biscuits for 8 silent, hungry men. The ranch hands were a rough lot. They ate with their heads down, eyes shifting toward her but never meeting hers. She heard them whispering when they thought she was out of earshot. "She will not last a week." One said, "Too soft. Town woman. Widow's luck." Another muttered, "Bad omen. Having her here." But Clara worked. When the dishes were done, she went to the barn. Eli had left a pile of torn harnesses and broken bridles that looked like they had been chewed by wolves. Her fingers, already raw from the cold, bled as she pushed the heavy needles through the stiff leather. She hauled water from the creek, chopping through the ice with a heavy pick, her shoulders screaming with the effort. She carried the buckets 2 at a time, slipping on the frozen mud, gritting her teeth to keep from crying out. Eli was a ghost on his own ranch. He rode out before dawn and returned after dark. When he was there, he was a force of controlled energy. She watched him break a colt in the round pen, his movements fluid and calm, never raising his voice, never striking the animal, just waiting, holding, until the horse accepted his weight. He was dangerous, she decided, but not in the way the town said. He was dangerous because he had no softness in him. He was like the land, indifferent. One evening, a blizzard howled down from the peaks, rattling the windows of the cookhouse. The men were eating in silence, the only sound the scraping of forks on tin plates. Clara stood by the stove, her hands tucked under her apron to hide the trembling. The cold had settled deep in her joints, and she could not stop shaking. She felt eyes on her. She looked up to see Eli watching her from the head of the table. He held a coffee cup in one large hand. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her shaking shoulders, his face unreadable. He stood up abruptly, scraping his chair back. The men jumped. Eli walked to the door, grabbed his coat, and went out into the storm. 10 minutes later, Clara was cleaning the last of the pots when the door opened. Eli walked in, shaking snow from his shoulders. He walked past her to the counter and set something down. Then he left, disappearing into the main part of the house without a word. Clara walked over. Sitting on the counter was a heavy wool blanket, smelling of cedar, and a small tin of salve. She opened the tin. It was thick, yellow grease, bear fat and turpentine. She rubbed it into her cracked, bleeding knuckles. The sting brought tears to her eyes, but the warmth that followed was the first comfort she had felt in weeks. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. It was heavy and scratchy, but it stopped the shaking. The next day, Clara was in the barn, sorting grain, when she heard voices on the other side of the stall wall. It was Shorty, the oldest hand, and a new rider named Red. Never seen him give a damn about anyone before. Red was saying, "You reckon he is sweet on her?" Shorty laughed. "A dry, hacking sound. Eli Barrett? Sweet. The man has ice water in his veins. You know why he is out here? Do you not?" "No," Red said. "I just heard he killed a man. He killed his own brother," Shorty whispered. "Down in Texas, over a woman, they say, or maybe over money. Barrett blood is bad blood. Son, his daddy was a rustler and his brother was a thief. Eli is just the one who survived. That is why the town looks at him like a loaded gun. They are just waiting for him to go off." Clara stood frozen in the grain bin. Killed his brother. The violence of the thought made her stomach turn. She had seen the way he looked at the world, with that guarded, defensive stare. Was it guilt, or was it the look of a man who knew he could never be forgiven? She finished her work quickly and went back to the house, avoiding Eli when he rode in that night. 2 days before her first month was up, Clara was awake late. The wind had died down, leaving a silence so profound it felt heavy. She was sitting by the window in her small room, mending a tear in her skirt by the light of a kerosene lamp. Something moved outside. Clara blew out the lamp and pressed her face to the glass. The moon was half full, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Down by the corrals, near the property line, a shadow detached itself from the trees. It was a man. He was on foot, moving quickly. He paused by the fence line, knelt down, and then stood up and ran back into the timber. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed her shawl and ran into the main house. She hesitated at Eli's door. She had never entered his private rooms. She knocked, sharp and hard. "Mr. Barrett." The door opened instantly. Eli was fully dressed, a rifle in his hand. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping. "What is it?" he snapped. "Someone is out there," Clara whispered, pointing toward the window. "By the south corral. I saw a man." Eli pushed past her, moving with terrifying speed. He went to the window, peering out into the dark. He watched for a long minute, his body tense as a bowstring. "Stay here," he ordered. He went out the back door. Clara waited, shivering in the hallway. She heard the crunch of his boots on the snow, then silence. 10 minutes later, he returned. He carried a pair of wire cutters in his hand, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "Did you see him?" Clara asked. Eli threw the wire cutters onto the table. They clattered loudly in the quiet room. "He cut the fence," Eli said, "and he left these." He pointed to the floor. Clara looked down. His boots were wet, but there was fresh mud on the heel. "Not just the fence," Eli said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "There were tracks, 2 men, and they were not just passing through. They were scouting." "Scouting for what?" Clara asked. "For weakness," Eli said. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the violence the men spoke of. It was there in his eyes, a sharp, glittering edge. "They know I am alone out here," he said, "and now they know you are here too." He walked to the gun rack on the wall and took down a second rifle. He checked the action and set it on the table. "This connects to you, Clara," he said, "the double bar. I have seen their riders on the ridge for weeks, but they never came close to the house until tonight." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "They followed me?" "Maybe," Eli said. "Or maybe they just decided it was time to squeeze us both." He looked at her, and the distance between them seemed to shrink. He was not looking at her like a burden anymore. He was looking at her like a soldier assessing a comrade. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "Thomas taught me," Clara said. Eli nodded. "Good. Keep that rifle in your room. If you hear anything at all, you fire into the air. Do not hesitate." He turned back to the window, watching the dark tree line. "Go to sleep. Clara, it is going to be a long winter." Clara took the rifle. The steel was cold in her hands. She looked at Eli's back, at the tension in his shoulders. He was a killer, they said, a man with bad blood. But as she watched him stand guard over the dark, snowy valley, she realized he was the only thing standing between her and the wolves. She went to her room, but she did not sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, the rifle across her knees, listening to the wind pick up again, sounding like a voice screaming to get in. The war for the valley had started, and she was right in the center of it. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It only brought a hard, revealing light to the valley. The snow from the night before had stopped, leaving the ranch blanketed in a deceptive white purity that hid the jagged rocks and the frozen mud. But the tension in the air was as visible as the breath steaming from the horse's nostrils. Eli changed the rhythm of the ranch before breakfast was finished. He did not shout, and he did not pace. He simply stood at the head of the long pine table in the cookhouse, his coffee cup resting near his hand, and gave orders with the flat, uninfected tone of a man reading a supply list. "Shorty, you and Red take the south ridge," Eli said. "Keep to the tree line. Do not ride in the open. If you see dust, you stop and you watch. Red, A young man with a face full of freckles and a nervous habit of tapping a spoon. Looked up. "We taking rifles?" "Boss." Eli looked at him. "You are always taking rifles. Red. But today you keep a round in the chamber." The room went quiet. The scrape of forks against tin plates ceased. In the West, a round in the chamber meant you expected to shoot before you had time to think. It was a shift from caution to war. Clara stood by the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. She saw the look in the men's eyes, not panic, but a grim settling. They were shifting their weight, adjusting their mindset from labor to defense. It was a look she had seen on Thomas's face in those last weeks, a shadowing of the spirit. She walked to the table to refill the coffee pot. As she poured into Eli's cup, he did not look up, but she saw the tension in his jaw, the way the muscle worked beneath the skin. "I need supplies," she said quietly. "The flour is low. We are out of coffee." Eli paused. He looked at the window, where the white glare of the snow pressed against the glass. "I will take the wagon in," he said. "You stay here. I'm going with you," Clara said. The table went silent again. Shorty looked at his plate. Eli turned his head slowly to look at her. "It is not a social call." "Clara, I know what it is," she answered, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "But I have letters to mail, and I will not hide out here like a fugitive. If I hide, they think they have won." Eli studied her face. He was looking for the hysteria the town expected of her, the fragility. He found only a pale, stubborn resolve. "Get your coat," he said. "We leave in 10 minutes?" The drive to Oakhaven was a study in silence. The wagon creaked and groaned over the frozen ruts, the iron wheels grinding against stone. Eli drove with a loose rein, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, the ridgeline, the cluster of scrub oak, the shadow of a hawk passing over the snow. Clara sat beside him, wrapped in her heavy coat, a buffalo robe pulled up to her waist. The proximity was unsettling. On the bench seat, their shoulders brushed every time the wagon hit a bump. She could smell the scent of him, wood smoke, saddle leather, and the sharp, metallic tang of gun oil. About 3 miles from town, they passed a group of riders moving north. They were too far away to see faces, but Clara saw the gear. Heavy canvas coats, high cantle saddles, and on the flank of the lead horse, a brand that looked like 2 distinct lines. "The double bar," she whispered. Eli did not turn his head, but his hands tightened on the leather ribbons. "I see them. They are the ones," Clara said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "The ones who hold the lien, the ones Thomas argued with." Eli nodded once. "They run cattle from the basin all the way to the railhead. They have been buying up small claims for 2 years. "Buying?" Clara asked bitterly. "Or stealing?" Eli glanced at her then. "In this valley, Mrs. Whitmore. The difference usually comes down to who is holding the pen and who is holding the gun." He clicked his tongue at the team, urging them faster. Clara watched the riders disappear into a fold of the land. She felt a cold prickle of recognition. The gear those men wore, the heavy dusters, the specific shape of the hats. It was the same silhouette she had seen at her fence line the week Thomas died. The threat to Eli's ranch and the theft of her home were not 2 separate fires. They were sparks from the same flint. Oakhaven looked like a sore on the landscape, a cluster of gray timber huddled against the wind. As Eli guided the wagon down the main street, the activity on the boardwalk seemed to stumble and slow. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Clara sat straighter, refusing to look down. Though her cheeks burned, she knew what they were seeing. The widow Whitmore, not yet 2 months out of mourning, riding into town on the wagon of Eli Barrett, a man the decent folk crossed the street to avoid. Eli pulled the wagon up in front of the mercantile and set the brake. He tied the reins and stepped down, then turned to offer her a hand. For a second, she hesitated. Taking his hand felt like a declaration. She took it. His grip was hard and calloused, swallowing her gloved fingers. He swung her down with an easy strength that made her feel weightless. "Stay close," he said low in her ear. Inside the store, the warmth was suffocating. The air smelled of pickle brine and sawdust. 3 women stood by the fabric bolts, Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, and 2 of the church elders' wives. They turned as the bell chimed. Their eyes swept over Clara, noting the wind-chapped skin, the hem of her coat that was stained with the ranch mud. "Clara, Mrs." Gable said. Her voice was sweet, heavy with a syrup that couldn't mask the poison. "We were just praying for you on Sunday." "Thank you," Clara said, moving toward the counter. "We heard you have taken employment." "Mrs." Gable continued, her eyes darting to the window where Eli was loading sacks of grain. "At the Barrett place. I work for a living," Clara said, "just like everyone else." "Mrs." Gable stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "My dear, we are only thinking of your soul and your reputation. To be out there, alone, with a man like that, a man with his appetites. It is not too late to come back to town. The church has a fund for destitute women. You could take in washing." Clara felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the stove. "You want me to wash your husband's shirts rather than run my own life? It is better than being the talk of the saloon." "Mrs." Gable snapped, her smile vanishing. "You are making a spectacle of yourself. A widow looking for a new bed before the old one is cold." Clara gripped the edge of the counter. Her fingers turned white. "Excuse me," she said. "I have supplies to buy." She turned her back on them, her heart hammering. The shopkeeper, Mr. Henderson, took her list without a word, his eyes downcast. He hurried to fill the order, eager to get her out of his store. When Clara stepped back out onto the boardwalk, the cold air hit her face like a slap. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her hands. "Well now, if it isn't the grieving widow." She froze. Leaning against the post of the awning was Deputy Miller. He was picking his teeth with a splinter of wood, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Good day, Deputy," Clara said, trying to step around him. He moved, blocking her path. He wasn't a tall man, but he was thick, and he smelled of stale whiskey and unwashed wool. "You look tired." "Clara," he said, using her Christian name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. "That ranch work is hard on a lady. Maybe too hard." "I am managing," she said. "You know," Miller said, leaning in closer. His eyes dropped to her chest, then back to her face. "That eviction notice is still sitting on the judge's desk. But papers can get lost. If a person has the right friends, I do not want your friendship. Deputy, I ain't offering friendship." He grinned, a wet, ugly expression. "I am saying that a woman in your position needs protection, and I could see to it that you keep that claim of yours, if you were a little more agreeable." The implication hung in the air, gross and undeniable. Clara felt a surge of nausea. "Get out of my way," she hissed. Miller laughed and reached out, his hand closing around her upper arm. "Now, don't be like that. I'm just trying to help you out of a cold winter." A shadow fell over them. It was not a sudden movement. It was a shifting of light, a blockage of the sun. Miller's smile faltered. He looked up. Eli stood on the boardwalk. He was not posturing. He was not reaching for the Colt on his hip. He simply stood there, less than 2 feet away, occupying the space with a density that made the air feel thin. "Let go of her arm," Eli said. His voice was not loud. It was a low rumble, like stones grinding together underwater. Miller blinked, his bravado slipping. "Now look here, Barrett, this is official county business." "Let go," Eli repeated. He did not blink. He looked at the deputy's hand on Clara's sleeve as if it were a diseased thing that needed to be severed. The street had gone quiet. Men loading wagons paused. The women inside the mercantile were watching through the glass. Miller released her arm. He took a step back, his hand drifting instinctively toward his holster, then stopping as he saw the look in Eli's eyes. It was a look of absolute, terrifying calm. "You are making a mistake." "Barrett," Miller muttered, adjusting his hat. "You are already on a short list." Eli ignored him. He turned to Clara. "You ready?" "Yes," Clara breathed. Eli did not offer his arm this time. He simply placed himself between her and the deputy, a human shield of canvas and muscle, and waited for her to climb onto the wagon seat. He untied the horses, climbed up beside her, and released the brake. As they rolled out of town, Clara looked back. Miller was still standing on the boardwalk, staring after them, his face twisted with a promise of retribution. The ride back was different. The silence was still there, but the quality of it had changed. It was no longer an awkward void. It was a shared space. Clara was shivering, the adrenaline fading into a cold shake. She sat close to Eli, closer than before. She could feel the heat radiating from his side, a solid, living warmth that anchored her against the wind. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible over the wheels. Eli kept his eyes on the road. "Do not thank me. I just made it worse for you. You stopped him," she said. "For today." Eli answered, "Men like Miller do not forget being humiliated. He will come back, and he will bring help." "Let him come," Clara said, surprised by her own ferocity. She looked at Eli's profile, the sharp nose, the dark stubble on his jaw, the way his hat brim shadowed his eyes. He was a hard man, a dangerous man. But when he had stood next to her on that boardwalk, she hadn't felt fear. She had felt a strange, terrifying safety. She shifted slightly, and her shoulder pressed against his arm. He didn't pull away. He didn't look at her, but she saw his hand tighten on the reins, the leather creaking under the pressure. She hated herself for the sudden, sharp desire to lean her head against his shoulder, to let him carry the weight of her grief and her fear for just 1 mile. Back at the ranch, the sky turned a bruised purple as evening set in. The wind picked up, screaming down from the peaks with a new ferocity. Clara went to the main house to start the evening meal. Eli was in the barn, seeing to the horses. She walked into the small office off the kitchen to fetch the ledger for the supply costs. Eli had asked her to keep the books the week before, admitting that his own handwriting was scratching like a chicken. She opened the heavy leather-bound book on the desk. The pages were filled with columns of numbers. She began to enter the costs of the flour and coffee, but her eyes drifted to the previous pages. She frowned. She turned back a month, then 2. Eli kept meticulous records. Every calf born, every steer sold, every pound of grain bought. But there were loose pages tucked into the back, scraps of paper with notes written in a hurried hand. Double bar shipment, October 12th, 400 head. Railhead manifest says 600. Whitmore claim, survey line moved 20 yards north. Freight cost, marked up 40%. Clara's breath caught. He wasn't just running a ranch. He was tracking them. He had been watching the fraud in the valley for months, maybe years. She heard the back door open and the stomp of boots. She quickly closed the book, her heart racing. She had found the proof that Eli Barrett was not just a brute. He was a man building a case. The storm hit an hour after sundown. It wasn't just snow. It was a whiteout, a wall of wind that hit the ranch with the force of a locomotive. They were in the kitchen. Clara, Eli, and the hands, eating a stew of beef and potatoes. The wind howled so loud they had to shout to be heard. Suddenly, a crack echoed like a gunshot, followed by a heavy, tearing sound. "The bunkhouse!" Shorty yelled, jumping up. Eli was out the door before the others had even stood. They rushed into the swirling white chaos. The roof of the bunkhouse had given way under the weight of the snow and the sheer force of the wind. One side had collapsed inward. It wasn't destroyed, but it was uninhabitable. "Get the bedrolls!" Eli shouted over the wind. "Move into the barn loft. It is dry." The men scrambled, grabbing blankets and gear. Clara stood in the doorway of the main house, holding a lantern that swung wildly in the gale. Eli pushed the last man toward the barn and turned back to the house. He stumbled through the door, forcing it shut against the wind with his shoulder. He locked the latch and leaned against the wood, breathing hard. He was soaked. The snow had melted into his coat, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. "Everyone safe?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Eli gasped. "Just timber and tar paper." The house felt suddenly very small. The storm had sealed them in. The men were in the barn. It was just the two of them in the main house. Eli shivered, a violent shudder that ran through his whole frame. "You are freezing," Clara said. "You need to get those wet clothes off." She moved to the stove, throwing in more wood, opening the damper to let the fire roar. Eli peeled off his heavy coat, his fingers fumbling with the buttons. His hands were blue with cold. "Here, let me," Clara said. She stepped in front of him. She didn't think about the propriety of it. She only saw the man who had stood between her and the deputy, shaking with hypothermia. She reached out and unbuttoned his vest. Her fingers brushed the damp cotton of his shirt. She could feel the heat of his skin beneath the wet fabric, radiating feverishly. Eli stood still, looking down at her. His breathing was ragged. Clara undid the cuffs of his shirt. Her hands were shaking. She peeled the wet fabric away from his wrists. "Please," Eli whispered. She looked up. His eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. "It's rubbing against it," he said, his voice rough. "What?" Clara asked, confused. "The cold," he said, but his gaze was dropped to her mouth. "It burns." She realized then how close they were. She was standing between his spread feet, her hands on his chest. The air in the kitchen was thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke and the sharp, electric scent of the storm. Clara felt a pull in her belly, a sudden, sharp ache of desire that shocked her. She wanted to lean forward. She wanted to press her face against his damp shirt. She wanted him to wrap those cold, strong hands around her waist. Eli's hand came up. He hesitated, his fingers hovering inches from her cheek. He looked like a man fighting a war inside his own skull. If he touched her, everything would change. The line between employer and employee, between widow and outcast, would be erased. The wind slammed against the house, shaking the floorboards. "Clara!" he said, and the way he said her name was like a touch. She leaned in, just an inch. Her breath hitched. Then Eli stepped back. He moved abruptly, turning away from her toward the fire. He gripped the mantelpiece with both hands, his knuckles white. "Get some blankets," he said. His voice was harsh, strained. "I will sleep by the fire. You go to your room." Clara stood there, her hands empty, her skin tingling where the heat of him had been. "Eli," she said softly. "Go, Clara, please." She retreated to the tech room, closing the door. She leaned against it, listening to the storm, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Morning brought a silence that was deafening. The storm had passed, leaving drifts of snow 4 feet high against the walls. Clara came out into the kitchen. Eli was already up, drinking coffee. He was dressed in dry clothes, his face shaved, his demeanor locked down tight behind that wall of reserve. But the air between them was charged. They moved around the kitchen like two magnets with the same polarity, pushing against each other, aware of every movement. Clara poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. "I saw the ledgers," she said. Eli stopped with his cup halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly. "You were snooping. I was working," she corrected. "I saw the notes. You know they are stealing. You have the numbers." Eli sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Knowing and proving are two different things, Clara, and proving it to a judge who drinks whiskey with the double-bar foreman is impossible." "Why do you stay?" Clara asked. "Why do you fight them?" "Because this is my land," Eli said simply. "And because I have run enough in my life." He looked at her, his gray eyes weary. "And you?" he asked. "Why do you not sell? Take what little cash they offer and go back east." Clara looked at her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "Because if I leave, Thomas died for nothing. They killed him. Eli, I know it in my soul. If I run, I am letting them get away with murder. But I am afraid," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I am afraid that if I fight, they will destroy me. They will take my name, my dignity, everything I have left, just like they did to Thomas." Eli reached across the table. He did not take her hand, but he placed his hand near hers, a silent offer of support. "They have already marked me." "Clara," The town sees a killer when they look at me. Caution has never saved me. It won't save you either. The only thing that saves you is standing your ground until they get tired of trying to move you." A heavy pounding on the front door made them both jump. Eli grabbed the rifle from the corner and moved to the door. He opened it a crack. A boy, shivering and wrapped in an oversized coat, stood on the porch. He held out a folded piece of paper. "For Mrs. Whitmore." The boy stammered. "From the court." Eli took the paper. The boy ran back to a horse that was chest deep in the snow and scrambled into the saddle, riding away as if the devil were at his heels. Eli handed the paper to Clara. She unfolded it. Her hands shook. Summons. It read, "Hearing regarding the estate of Thomas Whitmore, December 20th. Failure to appear will result in default judgment. December 20th. Clara whispered. "That is tomorrow." "They waited for the storm," Eli said darkly. "They knew the roads would be impassable. They want you to miss it. If you don't show, you admit the deed is valid. You lose everything." Clara looked at the paper, then at the window. The snow was deep. The ride would be brutal. And when she got there, the town would be waiting. The whispers, the stares, the deputy. "I have to go," she said. "I know." Eli said, "I will ride Bess. She can make it through the drifts." "You will not ride alone," Eli said. Clara looked at him. "If you ride with me, Eli." "They will talk. They will say everything misses." Gable hinted at. "They will say we are together. It will bring the town's hatred straight onto your name." Eli picked up his hat and settled it on his head. He looked at her, and for a moment, the wall came down. She saw the man beneath, lonely, fierce, and tired of being the villain in everyone else's story. "Let them talk," he said. "I have been the villain for a long time. Clara might as well be a villain for a reason worth fighting for." He opened the door. "Pack your warm things. We ride in an hour." The journey to Oak Haven was a battle against the earth itself. The storm that had trapped them in the ranch house had moved east, but it had left behind a landscape that was sullen and treacherous. The snow, heavy and wet, was beginning to melt under the glare of a hard, indifferent sun, turning the road into a slurry of freezing mud that sucked at the horses' hooves. Clara rode Bess, keeping the mare's head high as they navigated the swollen banks of Cut Creek. The water was gray and rushing, churning with chunks of ice that clattered against the rocks like bones. The sky above was a vast, terrifying blue, devoid of clouds, a wide-open eye that seemed to stare down at them, offering nowhere to hide. Eli rode ahead, his posture rigid. He did not look back often, but Clara could feel his awareness of her. Every time her horse stumbled on a hidden rock, his head would turn slightly, a check so subtle it was almost invisible. They were two small, dark figures moving across a canvas that was too big for them, exposed to the wind, the cold, and the judgment that waited at the end of the road. They reached the outskirts of town just before noon. The mud on the main street was churned deep by wagon wheels. As they rode past the first few houses, Clara felt the change in the air. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the silence. A woman sweeping her porch stopped and leaned on her broom, watching them pass with a gaze that was cold and speculative. A group of men loading barrels onto a dray paused, their eyes tracking Eli, then sliding to Clara with a look that made her skin crawl. They tied the horses in front of the courthouse, a brick building that was meant to look imposing but just looked tired. Eli tied the knots with deliberate slowness. "You do not have to say anything you are not ready to say," he told her quietly. Clara smoothed her skirts, though the mud had already ruined the hem. "I am ready to speak the truth. Eli, that should be enough." Eli looked at the courthouse doors. "In a fair fight, maybe, but we are not in a fair fight." The courtroom was stiflingly hot, heated by a pot-bellied stove that roared in the corner. The air smelled of stale tobacco smoke, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of men waiting for judgment. Clara sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Silas Prentice, the lawyer who had delivered the eviction notice, sat at the opposing table. Next to him sat a man Clara recognized with a jolt of nausea. It was Rourke, the foreman of the double bar. He was a big man, running to fat around the middle, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of suet. He wore a fine wool suit that strained at the buttons, and he was cleaning his fingernails with a small knife. Judge Holloway entered. He was a thin, bird-like man with spectacles that magnified his watery eyes. He glanced at Rourke and offered a tight, brief nod before turning his gaze to Clara. "We are here to settle the matter of the Whitmore claim," Holloway said, his voice scratching like a dry pen. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have petitioned to stay the execution of the lien held by the Double Bar Cattle Company. State your case." Clara stood up. Her legs felt weak, but her voice was steady. "Your Honor, my husband, Thomas Whitmore, never took a loan from the Double Bar. We built our home with our own hands. The deed is clear. The survey lines were established 5 years ago." Holloway shuffled the papers on his desk. He did not look at her. "I have the survey report here. Mrs. Whitmore, it seems there was an administrative error at the time of filing. The lines overlap with the Double Bar grazing rights. And as for the loan..." He held up a piece of paper. Clara recognized the forged signature she had seen weeks ago. "The document is signed and witnessed," Holloway said. "The witness is a man who works for the Double Bar," Clara argued, her voice rising. "And the signature is a forgery. My husband had a distinct hand. That scrawl is not his. I have letters, ledgers. I brought them to show the court." She turned to the clerk's table where she had deposited her satchel earlier. "Mr. Clerk, please show the judge the documents I provided." The clerk, a young man with a receding chin, looked down at his empty desk. He shuffled a stack of files, his face flushing pink. I seem to have misplaced that file." "Ma'am," he stammered. "Misplaced it?" Clara asked, the blood draining from her face. "It was right there. I gave it to you 10 minutes ago. I am sure it is here somewhere," the clerk mumbled. "But, currently, I cannot locate it." Judge Holloway banged his gavel. "Without evidence to the contrary, the court must accept the documents on hand. The signature stands." "But it is a lie!" Clara cried out. She looked around the room, desperate for a friendly face. The benches were full of townsfolk. She saw Mrs. Gable. She saw the shopkeeper, Henderson. They looked away. Then she looked at Rourke. The foreman was smiling. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a wolf that has cornered a rabbit. And in that moment, a memory flashed in Clara's mind. Sharp and terrible. The night Thomas died, he had come in from the barn, pale and sweating, clutching his chest. He had said, they were there, Clara, at the fence. She had thought he meant strangers. But looking at Rourke now, seeing the way he leaned back in his chair, comfortable in this room of law, she realized he had been there. He had been the stranger. "You were there," she whispered. Rourke raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me, ma'am. You were at my house," Clara said, her voice shaking with the force of the realization. "The night Thomas died, you and your men, you were pressuring him. You threatened him, didn't you? And when he collapsed, you just watched." Rourke chuckled, a low, wet sound. "Your Honor, the widow is clearly distraught. Grief does strange things to a woman's mind. I was at the bunkhouse playing cards that night. Ask anyone. I have 3 witnesses who can place Mr. Rourke at the Double Bar headquarters all evening," Silas Prentice said smoothly. Clara looked at the judge. He was already writing in his ledger. "Motion denied," Holloway said. "The lien stands, Mrs. Whitmore. You have 7 days to vacate the property completely. If you fail to do so, the sheriff will be instructed to remove you." "7 days?" Clara gasped. "But it is winter. Court is adjourned," Holloway said, standing up. Eli had been standing at the back of the room, silent as a statue. Now he moved. He walked down the center aisle, his boots heavy on the wood floor. The room went quiet. He stopped at the gate that separated the gallery from the court. He looked at the judge. He looked at Rourke. He did not say a word, but the contempt on his face was so potent, it felt like heat. Rourke stopped smiling. The judge cleared his throat nervously. Eli turned to Clara. He offered her his hand. "Come on," he said. "We are done here." Clara took his hand. It was the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved into lies. Walking out of the courthouse was worse than walking in. The verdict had traveled faster than they had. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the whispers started. Living with him out there? No shame at all. Poor Thomas must be spinning in his grave. Clara held her head up, but she felt the words like stones. They weren't just attacking her claim anymore. They were attacking her soul. To the town, she was no longer the victim of a land grab. She was a woman who had abandoned propriety to live in a bunkhouse with a man known for violence. A group of women stood outside the millinery. As Clara passed, one of them, a woman Clara had shared tea with only 3 months ago, pulled her skirts back, as if Clara were carrying a disease. "I heard she cooks for him," the woman whispered loudly. "And who knows what else she does for her keep." "Disgusting," another replied. "Hunger is one thing, but that is sin." Clara faltered. Her step hitched. Eli's hand tightened on her elbow, holding her up. "Keep walking," he murmured. "Do not give them the satisfaction." "Hey, Barrett!" The shout came from across the street. A man stood outside the saloon, swaying slightly. It was one of the drifters who often worked seasonal jobs for the cattle outfits. "You got yourself a nice new pet, don't you?" the drunk yelled. "Does she scream like your brother did? Or is she quiet like your daddy when they hung him?" The street went dead silent. Eli stopped. Clara felt the muscle in his arm turn to iron. The air around them seemed to drop 20 degrees. Eli turned his head slowly toward the drunk. The reference to his family, the shame that hung over the Barrett name like a shroud, was the one thing everyone knew never to touch. His father had been hanged for rustling 20 years ago. His brother had died in a knife fight that Eli had survived. It was blood and tragedy. And it was the weapon the town used to make him a monster. Eli let go of Clara's arm. He took one step toward the street. "Eli, no," Clara whispered. "Please." He stopped. He looked at her. His eyes were black with rage, a bottomless, terrifying anger that wanted to burn the town to the ground. But he saw the fear in her face. He saw that if he fought now, if he drew his gun or used his fists, he would only prove them right. He would be the savage, and she would be the savage's woman. He took a breath. It was a long, shuddering inhale. He turned his back on the drunk. "Get on the horse, Clara," he said. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of gray sky and white snow. Clara was numb. The cold seeped into her bones, but it was the shame that made her shiver. The way they had looked at her, as if she were contamination, as if her grief was just a cover for something distinct and dirty. They reached the ranch as the sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the snow. The horses were tired, their heads hanging low. As they rode into the yard, a patch of ice hidden by loose straw caused Bess to slip. The mare panicked, scrambling for footing, her back legs sliding out. Clara was thrown sideways. She didn't fall, but she lost her stirrup and slid dangerously to the side, clinging to the mare's mane. "Clara!" Eli was off his horse before it had fully stopped. He lunged across the gap between them, grabbing Clara by the waist and hauling her down from the saddle just as the mare kicked out in fear. He pulled her clear, his momentum carrying them both back against the rough wood of the corral fence. Clara landed hard against his chest, her feet dangling for a second before finding the ground. Eli's arms were wrapped around her, crushing her to him. It was a grip of panic, of desperate protection. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough. "Clara, look at me. Are you hurt?" I am fine," she gasped, her face pressed against the heavy wool of his coat. "I am fine." They stood there, breathing hard. The danger was past, but Eli did not let go. His arms were locked around her back, one hand tangled in the hair at the nape of her neck. Clara could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her own ribs. The adrenaline of the accident mixed with the rage of the town and the exhaustion of the day. Suddenly, the space between them wasn't just safe. It was electric. Clara looked up. Eli was looking down at her, his eyes searching her face. The distance he had kept so carefully for weeks was gone. He was holding her like he would never let her go. She felt a sob rise in her throat, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of being held, of being seen as precious, not as a problem. "Eli," she whispered. His gaze dropped to her mouth. His grip tightened, pulling her up onto her toes. For a second, just a heartbeat. She thought he was going to kiss her. The desire was there, raw and terrifying. She wanted him to. She wanted to forget the judge and the rumors and the empty house on the hill. She wanted to drown in the heat of him. Then he froze. He seemed to remember who he was and who she was. He remembered the drunk in the street and the women in the store. He remembered that his touch was considered a stain. He loosened his grip slowly, stepping back. His hands lingered on her arms for a second before dropping to his sides. "I will take the horses," he said. His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion. "Go inside. Get warm." He turned away, taking Bess's reins. Clara stood by the fence, watching him walk into the darkness of the barn, her body still humming with the memory of his arms. That night, the nightmares came. Clara was back in her old house. Thomas was sitting at the table, but his face was gone, replaced by the blank, smiling face of Rourke. He was counting money, stacking gold coins that turned into stones. "It doesn't add up. Clara," he kept saying, "the numbers don't add up." Then the door burst open, and shadows poured in. Men with no faces, only brands burned into their chests. They grabbed Thomas, and she tried to scream, but her mouth was full of grave dirt. She woke up with a cry that tore her throat. She sat bolt upright in the narrow bed of the tack room, gasping for air, sweat cooling on her skin. The darkness of the room felt heavy, suffocating. She wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking back and forth, trying to push the image of Rourke's smile out of her mind. A soft sound came from the hallway, a creak of a floorboard. Clara froze. "Who is there? It is me." Eli's voice came through the door, quiet and low. Clara let out a shaky breath. I had a bad dream. I heard," he said. There was a pause. She expected him to leave, to go back to his own room. But the footsteps didn't move away. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am scared." "Eli," she confessed to the darkness. "I am so scared." "I know," he said. He didn't open the door. He didn't offer empty platitudes, but she heard the scrape of a chair being pulled up against the wall outside her room. "Go back to sleep. Clara, I am right here. I won't leave." He was standing guard, not against the double bar, but against her terrors. His presence, unseen but felt, was a solid wall between her and the nightmares. Clara lay back down, pulling the quilt to her chin. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt she could close her eyes without falling. The next morning, the ranch was buried in a gray, silent cold. Eli was already out working the lines. Clara stayed in the main house, consumed by a restless energy. She couldn't just wait for the 7 days to run out. She couldn't let them win. She went to the corner where she had stacked Thomas's few belongings, the things she had managed to save before leaving the homestead: a worn saddlebag, a box of books, and his old heavy coat. She picked up the coat. It smelled faintly of him, tobacco and pine. She hugged it to her chest for a moment, then began to go through the pockets, looking for... She didn't know what. A memory, a sign. The outer pockets were empty. She checked the inside breast pocket. Nothing but a few grains of tobacco. She was about to put it down when she felt a crinkle. It came from the lining, near the bottom hem. She frowned. She ran her fingers over the wool. There was something sewn inside. She grabbed a pair of scissors from her sewing basket and carefully snipped the threads of the hem. She reached in and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She unwrapped it on the kitchen table. It was a small, black notebook, the kind Thomas used to tally cattle. But the pages weren't filled with his usual neat columns. They were scribbled, frantic notes. October 4th, saw 3 riders moving herd across North Ridge. Brands altered. Fresh burns. October 12th. 200 head loaded at the spur line. No bill of sale. Vance Rourke, supervising. October 15th. Spoke to Miller. He laughed, said the law costs extra, and on the last page, a single name written in bold, angry strokes. Judge Holloway, $500. Clara stared at the page. It wasn't just speculation. Thomas had written it down. He had tracked the stolen shipments. He had found the link between the double bar's theft and the officials who covered it up. The door opened, and Eli walked in. He stopped when he saw her face. "What is it?" he asked. Clara held up the notebook. Her hand was shaking, but her eyes were fierce. They didn't just kill him for the land, she said. They killed him because he knew. Eli walked over and took the book. He read the pages in silence. His face hardened, the muscles in his jaw bunching. "This is it," he said softly. "This proves the cattle theft, and it ties the judge to the payroll, but the judge won't look at it." Clara said, "And the sheriff is in their pocket. Then we do not take it to them," Eli said. He looked at her, and she saw a shift in him. The resignation was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating determination. "We gather more," he said. "We need to match these dates to the rail records. We need to find where they are holding the stolen stock before they ship it. We build a case so big that even the territory marshal cannot ignore it. But we have to do it quietly," Clara said. "If they know we have this, if they know, they will burn this ranch to the ground with us inside it." Eli finished. The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and domesticity. The external threat pressed against the walls of the ranch, but inside, a new rhythm formed. They were partners now. In the evenings, after the chores were done, they sat at the kitchen table. Clara cross-referenced Thomas's notes with Eli's own observations of the valley. Eli cleaned his guns, the smell of oil and metal mixing with the scent of the bread Clara baked. They ate together. They spoke in short, efficient sentences about the investigation, but the silence between the words was filled with a charged tenderness. When Eli passed her the salt, his fingers brushed hers, and neither of them pulled away immediately. When Clara poured his coffee, she stood close enough to feel the warmth of his shoulder, but they never crossed the line. The memory of the town's whispers was a wall between them, living in sin. If they acted on the pull between them, they would be proving the gossips right, and Eli, for all his roughness, was terrifyingly careful with her. He treated her reputation like it was a fragile glass thing he was terrified of breaking. It was a torture of its own kind, to be so close to the only person who understood the war they were fighting, and yet to be unable to touch him. 4 nights after the hearing, the violence arrived. It started with a sound that every rancher dreads, the low, rumbling thunder of a stampede. Eli was out of his chair instantly. "Cattle," he said. He grabbed his rifle and ran out the door. Clara followed to the porch. To the south, near the creek, the dark shapes of the herd were moving fast, a river of shadow pouring toward the breaks. Gunshots popped in the distance, sharp, bright flashes in the dark. "Riders!" Eli shouted. "Shorty! Red! Get to the horses!" The ranch hands scrambled from the barn. Eli didn't wait for a saddle. He vaulted onto his horse bareback and galloped into the dark. Clara stood on the porch, gripping the railing. She could hear the shouts, the crack of whips, the terrified bawling of the calves. It took an hour for the noise to die down. When the riders returned, the mood was black. They drove off about 50 head, Eli said, dismounting. "Cut the south fence in 3 places." Red slid off his horse and crumpled to the ground. "Red!" Clara cried, running down the steps. The young cowboy was clutching his arm. Blood was seeping through his coat sleeve. "They shot him?" Clara asked, horrified. "No," Shorty said, spitting into the dirt. "One of them swung a quirt, hit him across the forearm. Bone is broken, I reckon." "Help him inside," Clara ordered. "I have bandages." As they helped Red into the kitchen, Eli stood on the porch, staring out at the dark valley. He wasn't looking at the cut fence. He was looking at the bigger picture. Clara came back out after settling Red. She stood beside Eli. They are trying to scare us off. She said, "No," Eli said slowly. "This is not just fear. 50 head of cattle. That is a quarter of my winter stock. And the fence, that will take days to fix." He looked at her, his face grim in the moonlight. "They are not just trying to scare me. Clara, they are trying to bankrupt me. They know I have money tied up in feed for the winter. If I lose the herd, I can't pay the mortgage on this place come spring." He turned to look at her. "They want to ruin me so I can't help you. They want to strip us both bare so we have no money for lawyers, no money for travel, no voice to speak with." Clara looked at the hard set of his jaw. "Then we have to move faster," she said. Eli nodded. "Yes, we stop playing defense. Tomorrow, we start hunting." The winter did not just arrive, it conquered. By January, the valley was locked in a stranglehold of ice and gray sky that turned the world into a monochromatic prison. The thermometer on the porch hardly ever rose above freezing, and the wind had teeth, chewing through the chinking of the log walls and finding every gap in a man's coat. The ranch ceased to be a business and became a fortress of survival. The cattle were losing weight, their ribs pressing against their winter coats as they huddled in the lee of the ridges. The creek froze solid, requiring Eli and the hands to spend hours every morning chopping through 2 feet of ice so the animals could drink. Clara learned that exhaustion was not a feeling, but a state of being. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, were now red and chapped. The skin split at the knuckles. She did not complain. She wrapped them in rags soaked in tallow and went back to work. She took over the logistics of the ranch because there was no one else to do it. Eli was outside from dark to dark, riding the lines, hauling hay, and fighting the elements. Clara organized the dwindling supplies. She rationed the flour and the coffee. She took the chaotic pile of receipts and ledgers from the office and beat them into submission. It was in the numbers that she saw the shape of the monster they were fighting. She sat at the kitchen table late one night, the lamp burning low. Eli had just come in, stomping the snow from his boots. He looked gray with fatigue, his eyes rimmed with red. "They are squeezing the whole valley," Clara said, her voice rough with tiredness. "I went back 3 years in these books. The price of freight has gone up 40%, but only for the independent ranches. The double bar pays a flat rate that is half of what you pay." Eli poured himself a cup of coffee, his movement stiff. "It is the volume discount, they say." "It is not volume," Clara said, tapping the page. "It is a stranglehold. They raise the cost of shipping until you can't afford to sell your beef. Then they offer to buy your stock for pennies on the dollar. It is a system. Eli, they starve you out. Then they eat you." Eli looked at her. The firelight caught the sharp angle of her cheekbone. She had lost weight, but it had stripped away the softness to reveal something harder, like iron tempered in a forge. "You have a mind for the ugly parts of the world." "Clara," he said. "I never wanted to." She answered, "I just wanted to keep my house." He watched her for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out something small and set it on the table between them. It was her tortoiseshell comb. She had snapped it 2 weeks ago, trying to pull it through her tangled hair after a day of wind. She had thrown the pieces in the trash, frustrated to tears. Now, it sat on the wood, whole again. Eli had drilled tiny holes in the shell and bound the pieces together with fine silver wire, twisting it into a delicate, decorative pattern that looked like a vine. "You fixed it," she whispered. "I found it in the bin," Eli said, looking down at his coffee. "Seemed a shame. It is a pretty thing." Clara picked it up. The wire was smooth against her thumb. He must have spent hours filing the sharp edges down so it wouldn't snag her hair. He had done this with his large, scarred hands, by candlelight, while his body must have been screaming for sleep. "Thank you, Eli." He shrugged, shifting his weight. Just wire and time. But it wasn't. It was an act of care in a world that offered none. Clara looked at him, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt a warmth in her chest that wasn't just survival. It was the terrifying, fragile hope of being seen. When he said her name now, Clara, it didn't sound like a summons. It sounded like an anchor. The blow. When it came, was sudden and cruel. It was a Tuesday, a day when the sun had finally broken through the clouds, offering a false promise of spring. Shorty, the oldest hand on the ranch, had taken the wagon to the upper pasture to drop hay for the stragglers. He never came back for dinner. Eli rode out when the sun touched the western peaks. Clara waited on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the trail. The dread in her stomach was a cold, heavy stone. She saw the horse first. It was Shorty's gelding, trotting nervously back toward the barn, the saddle empty. 2 hours later, Eli led the wagon team into the yard. The wagon was not with them. Across the back of his own horse, a long bundle was wrapped in a tarp. Clara ran down the steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. Eli slid from the saddle. He didn't look at her. He looked at the ground, his face a mask of stone. "Is he hurt?" Clara asked, though she knew. She knew by the silence of the other hands who were gathering around. "He is gone," Eli said. His voice was a hollow scrape. "Wagon went over the cut," Red said, his voice trembling. He had ridden out with Eli. "We found him at the bottom of the ravine. Neck broke." Eli walked to the horse and untied the ropes holding the body. He gathered the old man in his arms as if he weighed nothing. Shorty had been with the Barrett family for 30 years. He had taught Eli to ride. "It was an accident," Red said, wiping his nose. "The brake lever. It must have snapped." Eli stopped. He turned slowly to look at Red. The brake lever was sawed through. Eli said, "The silence in the yard was absolute." The wind whistled through the corral slats. "Sawed?" Clara whispered. "Halfway through," Eli said, his voice vibrating with a suppressed rage that was more frightening than shouting, just enough to hold until he put weight on it at the steep grade. "They killed him," Clara said. The words tasted like ash. Eli carried the body into the bunkhouse. "We bury him tomorrow." The funeral was brief. The ground was frozen hard. And it took the men 4 hours to dig a grave deep enough to keep the wolves out. They buried Shorty on the rise behind the barn, under a twisted pine tree. No one came from town. When Red had ridden in to report the death, the sheriff had shrugged. "Ranch work is dangerous," he had said. "Wagons break. Tell Barrett to keep his equipment in better repair." That night, the grief in the main house was a physical thing. The ranch hands were drinking whiskey in the barn, mourning their friend. Clara and Eli were alone in the kitchen. Clara was washing dishes, the water scorching her hands, but she couldn't stop shivering. She scrubbed the same plate over and over, staring at the bubbles. "They killed him because of us," she said. Her voice broke. "He was an old man. He never hurt anyone. They killed him to send a message." Eli sat at the table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He hadn't opened it. He was staring at the label, his hands clenched into fists. "It is my fault," he said. "I should have checked the wagon. I should have known they would target the weak spots. You cannot check every bolt and strap every hour of every day." Clara spun around, water flying from her hands. "It is not your fault, Eli. It is theirs. They are monsters." Eli looked up. His eyes were tortured. "I dragged him into this. I dragged you into this. Everyone who stands next to me ends up bleeding." He stood up so fast the chair clattered backward. He turned toward the window, bracing his hands against the frame, his head hanging low. "I am poison. Clara, you should have left when you had the chance." Clara crossed the room. She didn't think. She didn't calculate the risk. She saw the man who had fixed her comb, who had stood between her and the deputy, who was breaking under the weight of a guilt that wasn't his. She reached out and laid her hands on his back. Through the flannel shirt, his muscles were rock hard, tense as wire. "You are not poison," she said fiercely. "You are the only decent thing in this entire valley." Eli turned around. The movement was abrupt, catching her off guard. He looked down at her, and the raw pain in his face tore at her heart. "They will kill you too," he whispered. "If you stay, they will have to," she said, "because I am not leaving." She saw the dam break behind his eyes. The control he held onto so tightly, the restraint that defined him, shattered under the force of the grief and the fear. He reached for her. His hands gripped her arms, pulling her to him. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, letting out a sound that was half groan, half sob. Clara wrapped her arms around him, holding him up. He was heavy, solid, and he smelled of cold air and sorrow. She pressed herself against him, seeking the warmth, the affirmation that they were still alive. His hands moved up her back, tangling in her hair. He lifted his head, and his mouth found hers. It was a kiss of desperation. It tasted of salt and fear. Clara opened to him, a fire igniting in her belly that burned away the cold of the winter. For a moment, there was no double bar, no dead husband, no frozen grave. There was only the heat of his body, the roughness of his beard, the desperate, hungry pressure of his mouth. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders. She wanted this. She wanted to be consumed by it. Then, the fear struck her. It wasn't fear of him. It was fear for him. Everyone who stands next to me ends up bleeding. If she loved him, and God help her, she was falling in love with him. She became the target, and he became the man who would die trying to save her. She gasped, pulling back, breaking the kiss. "No," she whispered. Eli froze. He looked at her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide and dazed. Clara stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. Tears pricked her eyes hot and fast. "I can't," she choked out. "I can't do this." Eli straightened up. The mask slammed back into place, but she saw the hurt behind it. "Clara, if we do this," she said, her voice shaking, "it becomes another weapon they can use. They will use my love to hurt you. They will use your love to destroy you. I cannot be another thing you have to die for. Eli!" She turned and ran to the door of the tack room, slamming it shut behind her. She slid down to the floor, pressing her hands over her ears, sobbing quietly as she listened to the silence from the kitchen. An hour later, there was a knock on her door, soft, tentative. Clara wiped her face. She opened it. Eli stood there. He looked calmer now, but the weariness was etched deep into his features. "We need to talk," he said, "not about that, but about why the town hates me." Clara nodded and stepped back, letting him in. He didn't sit. He stood by the door, needing the escape route. "You hear stories," he said, "about my brother, about my father." "I heard you killed your brother," Clara said quietly. Eli looked at his hands. "My father was a rustler. That part is true. He swung for it when I was 12. My brother, Jacob, he was older. He had the charm. He could talk a bird out of a tree. The town loved him." He looked up, meeting her eyes. "But Jacob was worse than my father. He didn't just steal cattle. He hurt people. He liked it. There was a girl in Abilene." Eli swallowed hard. "I found out what he did. I told him he had to turn himself in. He laughed. He pulled a knife on me. It was him or me. Clara, I didn't want to do it. But I couldn't let him walk away." "So you defended yourself," Clara said. Eli nodded. "But the town, they didn't know about the girl. They only knew Jacob bought rounds at the saloon and smiled at their wives. They decided I was the jealous younger brother who murdered his own kin for a share of the inheritance. It was a cleaner story, an easier story. It let them keep loving the memory of Jacob and hate the man who ended him." Clara looked at him, seeing the burden he had carried for 20 years. The injustice of it burned in her throat. "I have a secret too," she whispered. Eli waited. "Before Thomas died, before the heart attack, I knew something was wrong. He was acting strange, scared, and I was annoyed with him." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I thought he was drinking again. I thought he was gambling. I saw him staring out the window at night, and instead of asking him what was wrong, I went to bed angry. I didn't want to know. I was afraid to know." She looked at Eli, tears spilling over. "If I had spoken up, if I had forced him to talk to me, maybe we could have left. Maybe he would still be alive. I stayed quiet to keep the peace, and it cost him his life." Eli stepped forward. He didn't touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel his presence. "We both carry ghosts, Clara, but guilt is a useless thing to pack in your saddlebag. It just adds weight. He looked toward the window, where the night pressed against the glass. They killed Shorty. They killed Thomas. They tried to ruin your name and my ranch. I am done waiting for them to make the next move. What do we do? Clara asked. We go on the offense, Eli said. We need proof that will stand up outside of this valley. We need a federal marshal. But to get a marshal, we need hard evidence, paperwork, the freight logs, Clara said, her mind snapping back to the problem. If we can get the actual shipping manifests from the depot and match them to the Double Bar's sales records, we can prove they are shipping more cattle than they own. And I need to find where they are hiding the stolen stock, Eli said. They are not shipping them immediately. They are holding them somewhere, changing the brands. If I can find that pen, it is dangerous. Clara said. Caution didn't save Shorty. Eli replied grimly. I will go to town. Clara said. I will get the logs. You can't go alone. I have to. If you go, they will watch you. I am just the widow. They think I am beaten. They think I am weak. I can use that. Clara rode into Oakhaven 2 days later. The air was brittle with cold. She wore her black morning dress under her coat, her face pale and drawn. She looked exactly like what they expected. A broken woman. She tied Bess at the rail and walked to the freight depot near the train tracks. The town was busy. Men ignored her. Women averted their eyes. She entered the depot office. A stove burned in the corner. Behind the cage-like counter sat a man named Samuel Abernathy. He was a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and a pair of spectacles that were constantly sliding down his nose. Clara knew him from church. He was a quiet man, often bullied by the louder, rougher sort. Mrs. Whitmore, Samuel said, surprised. I didn't expect to see you. Clara walked to the counter. She didn't whisper. She didn't look furtive. She looked desperate. Mr. Abernathy, I'm looking for a package. From my sister in Ohio. It should have been here weeks ago. There is nothing for you. Clara, Samuel said gently. Please, she said, leaning in. Her eyes searched his. Just check the logs, please. Samuel sighed and opened the heavy ledger on the counter. Clara watched his hands. Samuel, she said, her voice dropping so low only he could hear. I know about the extra shipments. Samuel's hand froze on the page. He didn't look up. I don't know what you mean, he whispered. I think you do, Clara said. I think you see the cattle go out at night. I think you see the numbers on the manifests that don't match the tax records. I think you are a good man who is tired of being afraid of Rourke and Miller. Samuel looked up then. His eyes were wide with terror. Mrs. Whitmore, if they knew I talked to you, they killed my husband, Samuel. They killed Eli Barrett's ranch hand. Who is next? You? Samuel swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed. What do you want? Copies? She said. Of the Double Bar shipments for the last 6 months and the incoming freight for the mercantile? I know they are price-fixing. I can't give you the book. Copy them, Clara said. Hand copy them. I will come back tomorrow. Leave them in an envelope at the church, under the hymnal in the last pew. Samuel looked at the door. He looked at Clara. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the steel. They are monsters, he whispered. I know, Clara said. Help me stop them. He nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. Go, before Miller sees you. Clara turned to leave. She opened the door and ran straight into a wall of wool and leather. Deputy Miller stood there, blocking the sunlight. Well, he grinned. If it isn't the little widow. Clara stepped back. Excuse me, deputy. Buying a ticket out of town? Miller asked, stepping into the office. He glanced at Samuel, who was frantically pretending to sort mail. Or are you just looking for trouble? I am minding my own business, Clara said. You don't have any business, Miller said, his voice hardening. You don't have a claim. You don't have a husband, and pretty soon, you won't have a place to sleep out at that ranch either. He leaned down, his face close to hers. He smelled of tobacco and rot. We know you are scraping around. Clara, looking for answers. Here is an answer for you. Go away. or you might have an accident, just like that old man. Clara felt a spike of fear, but it was drowned out by a cold, white-hot fury. "Is that a threat? Deputy?" she asked loud enough for the people on the platform to hear. Miller blinked, surprised by her tone. "It is advice, lady." Clara walked around him. She didn't run. She walked to her horse, untied the reins, and mounted. She felt Miller's eyes on her back, burning like a brand, while Clara was in town. Eli was deep in the broken country to the north of the ranch. He had left his horse tied in a copse of trees and moved on foot, climbing the shale ridges where the wind scoured the rock clean. He was tracking the missing 50 head. The snow made it difficult. The wind covered tracks within an hour. But Eli knew how cattle moved. They sought shelter. They sought water. He found the trail near a box canyon known as Devil's Pocket. It was a narrow, dangerous draw with steep walls. Most ranchers avoided it because it was a box trap. If a flash flood hit, there was no way out. Eli lay on his stomach on the rim of the canyon. Using his field glasses, below him, hidden from the main trail, was a makeshift corral built of rope and cut timber. Smoke curled from a small fire. He adjusted the focus. There were 3 men down there. One of them was working a branding iron in the fire. Eli watched as they roped a steer, a Hereford with a distinctive white face. He saw the animal struggle. He saw the man press the hot iron onto the flank. The smoke rose, thick and dark. They weren't just altering brands. They were using a running iron, a straight rod used to freehand new lines over old ones. They were turning the circle W of the Whitmore claim and the bar B of Eli's ranch into the blocky double bar. Eli scanned the rest of the herd. There were hundreds of cattle down there, not just his cattle from every small ranch in the valley that had failed in the last 2 years. It was a holding pen, a laundering operation. He shifted his gaze to the men by the fire. He recognized one. It was the man who had been at the hearing. Rourke. Eli felt a cold satisfaction settle in his gut. He had found the artery. They reunited at the ranch that night. The exhaustion hung on them like wet wool. But the energy in the kitchen was frantic. Clara laid out the plan. Samuel agreed. "I have to go back tomorrow to get the papers, and I found them," Eli said. "Devil's Pocket. Rourke is there personally, rebranding the stolen stock. We have them," Clara said, her eyes shining. "We have the theft. We have the fraud. It is not enough," Eli said quietly. Clara stopped. "What?" "Theft gets them a fine, maybe a few months in jail for the hired hands. Rourke will blame it on his underlings. The judge will let him off." Eli leaned forward. "We have to tie it to the murder. Clara, we have to prove that they killed Thomas because he found this out. We have to prove the deed is a forgery created to cover the theft. If we just expose the cattle rustling, the town will call it a ranch dispute. They will say it is just business. We have to make it capital," Eli said. "We have to make it a hanging offense, or they will just come back in the spring." Clara looked at the table, at the repaired comb, at the ledgers. "The deed," she said. "Silas Prentice holds the original deed. If we can prove the paper itself is new, or the ink is fresh, or if we can find the original survey map that Samuel might have access to," Eli added. Clara nodded. "Tomorrow, when I get the logs from Samuel, I will ask him about the survey archives. And Eli said, checking the load in his revolver, "I'm going to go back to Devil's Pocket. I'm going to watch, and I am going to wait for a mistake." The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. They sat in the circle of lamplight, conspirators in a dangerous game, bound by grief and a love they were too afraid to name, plotting to bring down the men who owned the world. The kitchen table looked less like a place for meals and more like a general's map of a losing war. The oil lamp sputtered low, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls, illuminating the spread of papers that Clara and Eli had assembled over the last week. It was a damning mosaic. On the left were the handwritten notes Clara had found in Thomas's coat, dates, times, and rough descriptions of cattle moving by moonlight. In the center were the duplicate freight logs Samuel had terrifiedly copied by hand in the back of the depot. And on the right, Eli's own grim tally of the cattle laundering operation in Devil's Pocket. Clara traced a line with her finger, her nail dirt-stained and broken. "Here," she said, her voice raspy with fatigue. October 12th. The freight log shows a shipment of 400 head departing the depot. The manifest lists the seller as the double bar. But look at the weight. Eli leaned over her shoulder, his presence a heavy, warm weight. "The average weight per head is too low for steers," he noted. "Exactly," Clara said. "It matches the weight of yearlings, the exact number of yearlings stolen from the mesmerizing Miller spread and the Lazy J in late September. And here—" She moved her finger to a date that made her heart stop every time she looked at it. October 24th. She whispered, "The day Thomas died." Eli looked at the paper. The note in Thomas's book was simple. "Rourke, fence line, 4 p.m. "And here," Clara said, pulling a copied page from the stack. "The depot log for that same day. Rourke signed for a shipment of barbed wire at noon. But the signature, look at the witness line." Eli squinted at the cramped handwriting. "Deputy Miller. They were together that day." Clara said, "The deputy and the foreman. They were in town at noon, and by 4, they were at my fence line threatening my husband. They claimed they were playing cards in the bunkhouse. This proves they lied." Eli straightened up, pacing to the window. He pushed the curtain aside with the barrel of his rifle, checking the dark yard. The wind was howling, a constant, lonely sound that seemed to isolate the ranch from the rest of the world. "It is a circle," Eli said, his voice hard. "The deputy protects the theft. The judge validates the forged deeds. The double bar takes the land, and Rourke does the dirty work." He turned back to her, and the look in his eyes was terrifying. "We have the proof, Clara, but a piece of paper does not stop a bullet, and that is what they are coming with next." Clara looked at the papers. She felt a wave of nausea. She had wanted the truth, but the truth was hideous. It wasn't just greed, it was a machine, grinding people into dust to feed itself. "We take this to the territorial marshal," she said. Eli laughed. A short, bitter bark. "The marshal is 3 days' ride away in Capital City. We won't make it 10 miles out of the valley. They are watching the roads. Then we reveal it here." Clara insisted. "We force the town to look at it." "The town doesn't want to look," Eli said. He walked to the table and placed his hands flat on the wood, leaning down to look her in the eye. "Clara, they cut off our credit at the feed store today. Did you know that?" Clara blinked. "What?" "I went for grain this morning. Old man McGregor told me to get out, said my money is no good. He said the bank threatened to call his own loan if he did business with me." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "They are starving the cattle. They are starving us," Eli corrected. "The neighbors turn their backs when we ride by. The hands are getting restless. Red's arm is healing, but his spirit is broken. They are waiting for us to starve or run." He reached for his gun belt hanging on the chair. "I am done with papers. Clara, I am going to ride to Devil's Pocket tonight. I will burn that holding pen to the ground and scatter those cattle. If I catch Rourke there—" "No!" Clara stood up, grabbing his arm. Eli looked at her hand on his sleeve. His muscles were tight as steel cables. "If you ride out there and kill Rourke," Clara said, her voice shaking, "you become exactly what they say you are. A murderer, a savage. The town will hunt you down and hang you, and they will feel righteous doing it. I would rather be hanged for fighting than die starving in the snow." Eli snarled. "It is not just about you," Clara shouted. The silence that followed was sudden and ringing. "If you kill him," Clara said, lowering her voice, "the truth dies with him. Thomas remains a failure who lost his land. I remain the widow who couldn't hold on. The double bar keeps everything." She stepped closer, forcing him to look at her. "We have to break the lie, Eli. We have to show the town that they have been accomplices to murder. If we use violence, we lose. We have to use the truth." Eli stared at her for a long time. The rage in his eyes slowly cooled, replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. He covered her hand with his own. "You are asking me to stand still while they shoot at us," he said softly. I am asking you to be the man they say you cannot be. Clara answered, I am asking you to be better than them. The next day, they rode out to the high ridge to check the northern fence line. It was a gray, sullen afternoon, the clouds low and heavy with unfallen snow. They were riding side by side, the horses picking their way through the scree. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the things they couldn't say, the fear of what was coming, the knowledge that they were two people standing against an avalanche. They reached a narrow pass where the trail cut between two granite boulders. Suddenly, the air cracked. A split second later, the sound of the rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls. Bess shied violently, rearing up. Clara screamed, clutching the saddle horn. A spray of rock fragments exploded from the boulder inches from her head, stinging her cheek. "Get down!" Eli roared. He launched himself from his horse, not away from the danger, but toward her. He grabbed her waist and dragged her out of the saddle, pulling her to the ground behind the cover of the rocks. Another shot whined overhead, burying itself in the trunk of a pine tree. Eli covered her body with his own, pressing her into the frozen earth. He had his revolver drawn, scanning the ridgeline above them. "Stay down," he hissed into her ear. Clara lay beneath him, her face pressed into the dirt and snow. She could feel the heavy, rapid thud of his heart against her back. She could smell the dust on his coat and the sharp scent of gun smoke. They lay there for 10 minutes, an eternity of cold and terror. The wind whistled through the rocks. No more shots came. It was a warning. Eli whispered finally, "They could have hit us. They missed on purpose." He sat up slowly, keeping low. He helped Clara to sit up. She was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "They want us to know they can touch us whenever they want," Eli said, his voice trembling with suppressed fury. Clara touched her cheek. Her fingers came away with a smear of blood where a rock chip had cut her. Eli saw the blood. His face went white. He reached out and touched the small wound, his thumb brushing away the red drop. His hand was shaking. "Clara," he choked out. He grabbed her then. It wasn't the protective grab of the ambush. It was a desperate, terrifying need to hold her. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her hair. "I thought," he whispered, "when I heard the shot, I thought—" "I am here," Clara sobbed, clutching his coat. "I am here." They clung to each other in the snow, the horses waiting nervously nearby. The fear had stripped away the last of their defenses. The propriety, the town's judgment, the careful distance, it all evaporated in the face of the bullet. "Let's go home," Eli said, his voice rough. The ride back was a blur. When they reached the ranch, the sun was down. The kitchen was cold. They didn't light the lamp. Eli locked the door and barred it. He turned to Clara. She was standing by the stove, still wearing her coat, shivering uncontrollably. It was the shock, the cold, the terror. Eli walked to her. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He took her face in his hands. "Clara," he said. She looked up at him. In the dim light coming from the embers of the stove, his face was open, unguarded. The violence she had always sensed in him was there, but it wasn't directed at her. It was a fierce, protective wall, and behind it was a love so intense it frightened her. She reached up and took his wrists. "I don't want to die," she whispered. "You won't," he swore, "not while I breathe." He kissed her. It wasn't like the kiss in the kitchen weeks ago. That had been a collision of grief. This was a surrender. Clara opened her mouth to him, tasting the salt on his skin. She pressed her body against his, needing the friction, the heat, the undeniable proof of life. Eli groaned low in his throat. He lifted her, setting her on the edge of the table. His hands moved over her, frantic and worshipping, pulling off her gloves, unbuttoning her coat to find the warmth of her beneath. Clara's hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer. The fear that had been her constant companion for months transmuted into desire. If they were going to die, if the town was going to burn them down, she would not go out without knowing this. She would not let them take this from her too. They moved together in the darkness, a desperate tangle of limbs and breath. There were no words. Words were for the lawyers and the liars. This was primal. It was the only answer to the death waiting outside the door. When his skin touched hers, hot and rough, Clara cried out softly, not in pain, but in release. She wrapped her legs around him, anchoring him to her. They held nothing back. In the shadow of the valley that wanted to destroy them, they created a moment of absolute, defiant connection. Later, they lay together on the narrow bed in the tack room, covered by the heavy buffalo robe. The fire in the stove popped quietly. Eli held her against his chest, his arm heavy over her waist. Clara traced the scars on his hand with her fingertips. "I am not sorry," she whispered into the dark. "Neither am I," Eli said. He kissed the top of her head, but now the stakes are higher. He said, "Before, I was fighting for my land and your justice. Now I'm fighting for my life," he said, "because you are my life now. Clara, the morning brought a hard, bright sun that hurt the eyes." The tenderness of the night before was packed away, hidden deep in their chests, fueled by a new, steely resolve. "We have to finish this," Clara said over breakfast. "We need the final link, the receipt from the supply run that ties the deputy to the stolen wire." Samuel said he found it. Eli said, checking his revolver. He said he would have it today. They rode into town together. They didn't ride with heads down. They rode upright, side by side. The town watched them coming. The whispers were louder now, more vicious, shameless. Whore, killer. They tied the horses at the post office. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, a crowd began to gather. It wasn't accidental. Sheriff Brady stepped out of the saloon, followed by Deputy Miller and Rourke. "Hold it right there. Barrett," the sheriff called out. Eli stopped. He didn't move his hand toward his gun, but his stance shifted, balanced and ready. Clara stood next to him. "We have business." "Sheriff," Eli said. "Your business is done," the sheriff said. He was a man who had once been decent, but years of looking the other way had eroded his spine. "We have a sworn complaint." "Eli." "Complaint?" Eli asked. "Stock theft," Rourke said, stepping forward with a smirk. "We found 50 head of double-bar cattle up in a canyon near your north line. Brands altered. Looks like you have been building your herd at my expense." The audacity of the lie took Clara's breath away. They were accusing Eli of the very crime they were committing. "That is a lie," Clara shouted, stepping forward. "You are the one stealing. We have proof." The sheriff looked at her with pity and disgust. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are distraught, and you are keeping bad company. This man is a rustler, just like his father. I am arresting you, Barrett," the sheriff said, putting his hand on his gun, "for grand larceny." The crowd murmured. This was it, the trap. If Eli drew his gun, they would shoot him down in the street. If he surrendered, he would rot in a cell until the ranch was gone. Eli looked at the sheriff. Then he looked at Rourke. "You found cattle on my land?" Eli asked loudly. "Or did you plant them there last night after you took a shot at us?" "I don't know what you are talking about," Rourke said. Clara saw a movement in the window of the freight office. Samuel was there, his face pale as milk. He held up a piece of paper against the glass for a split second, then vanished. He had it. Clara turned to the sheriff. "You want to talk about theft? Let's talk about the freight records. Let's talk about the missing pages from the county deed book." She pointed a shaking finger at the clerk, Mr. Perkins, who was standing in the doorway of the courthouse eating an apple. "Mr. Perkins!" Clara yelled. "You told the judge you lost my husband's file, but I saw you with it yesterday. I saw you hand it to Silas Prentice." The crowd turned to look at the clerk. Perkins choked on his apple. I did no such thing. You are a liar," Clara screamed. "And everyone here knows it. You are all letting them steal our lives because you are too afraid to speak up." The crowd shifted. Unease rippled through them. Clara wasn't acting like a broken widow. She was acting like a prosecutor. "That is enough," Deputy Miller shouted, stepping toward her. "Grab her." "Sheriff, She is disturbing the peace." Eli stepped in front of her. His voice dropped to that low, grinding rumble. "You touch her, Miller, and I will disturb your peace permanently." The standoff held for 10 seconds. Then, the door of the freight office opened. Samuel Abernathy stepped out. He looked like he was going to faint, but he walked straight to Clara. He didn't speak. He simply pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand and walked away, disappearing into the alley. Clara unfolded it. It was a freight receipt, dated October 24th. Received 50 spools barbed wire. Signed, Deputy C. Miller. For Double Bar Ranch. It proved the deputy was working for the cattle outfit on the day of the murder. Clara held it up. "I have it," she cried. "I have the proof." Rourke's face went dark. "Arrest him," he roared at the sheriff. "Shoot him if he resists." "We are leaving," Eli said. He grabbed Clara's arm and backed them toward the horses. The sheriff hesitated. The crowd was confused, their certainty shaken by Clara's accusation and Samuel's strange behavior. In the confusion, Eli swung into the saddle and pulled Clara up behind him on his horse. Bess had been spooked by the shouting. "Go!" Eli shouted. Kicking the horse, they galloped out of town, leaving the mob shouting in the dust. They made it back to the ranch as the sun began to dip. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving them exhausted. "They know we have it," Clara said, clutching the paper. "Samuel gave us the key." Eli paced the kitchen. "They won't wait for a warrant now. They will come tonight." Rourke saw the paper. He knows it ties him to the deputy and the timeline. "We have to leave," Clara said. "We have to ride to Capital City." "Tonight, we can't," Eli said. "The horses are blown. They need rest before a 3-day ride through the snow." "We leave at first light." He went to the gun cabinet and took out every weapon he owned. He loaded the rifles. He handed Clara a shotgun. "If they come," he said, "we hold the house. It is log. It will stop bullets." They sat in the dark kitchen, watching the moon rise over the snow. The silence was heavy. Clara reached out and took Eli's hand. "I love you," she whispered. Eli squeezed her fingers. "I know." The smell hit them first. It wasn't the smell of wood smoke. It was the sharp, chemical stench of kerosene. Eli's head snapped up. "The barn!" A flicker of orange light danced against the kitchen window. Then, a roar. They ran to the back door. The main barn. A massive structure of seasoned pine filled with 3 tons of winter hay. Was a wall of flame. "The horses!" Clara screamed. The ranch hands were already running from the bunkhouse, shouting. They ran into the yard. The heat was intense, searing their faces. The fire was roaring, climbing the walls with terrifying speed. Inside, the horses were screaming, a high, shrill sound of pure terror. "Open the doors," Eli yelled, sprinting toward the inferno. He grabbed the heavy handle of the main door. It was hot to the touch. He yanked it open. Smoke billowed out, thick and black. "Get them out," Eli roared, plunging into the smoke. Clara didn't think. She wrapped her shawl over her mouth and ran in after him. The inside of the barn was a nightmare of orange light and shadows. Sparks rained down from the loft where the hay was burning. The horses were thrashing in their stalls, kicking the wood to splinters. Eli was at Bess's stall, fighting to get the halter on the panicked mare. Clara ran to the next stall. It was the big roan. He was rearing, his eyes rolling white. "Easy." Clara screamed, coughing, "Easy." She managed to unlatch the door. She slapped the horse on the rump. "Go!" The horse bolted toward the open door. One by one, they cut them loose. Red and the other hands were dragging the tack out, saving what they could. The roof groaned. A burning beam crashed down into the center aisle, blocking the exit. "Eli!" Clara screamed. Eli was on the other side of the beam. He looked at her through the flames. "Get out, Clara!" He grabbed a blanket, threw it over the head of the last horse, and vaulted onto its back. He drove the animal straight at the back door, smashing through the latch. Clara turned and ran. She stumbled out into the snow, gasping for air, her lungs burning. A moment later, Eli rode the horse around the side of the barn. He slid off, coughing, his face blackened with soot. They stood together in the yard, watching the barn die. The structure collapsed with a sound like a thunderclap, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. The heat melted the snow for 50 feet in every direction. "They burned it," Clara said, her voice hollow. "The winter feed, the saddles, the tack. They stood in the wreckage of their livelihood. Without the hay, the cattle would starve. Without the barn, the ranch was crippled." Eli wiped the soot from his eyes. He looked at the burning pile. Then he looked at the house, which stood untouched in the shadows. "They want us to fight the fire," he said quietly. "They want us to spend the night hauling water, trying to save the boards and the nails." He turned to the hands. "Let it burn." Red looked at him. "Boss, let it burn," Eli shouted. "Get the horses into the corral, secure them, but let the damn barn burn." He turned to Clara. He grabbed her shoulders. His eyes were wild, brilliant in the reflection of the fire. "They think this hurts me," he said. "They think burning my property makes me weak." He looked at the fire, then back at her. "I don't care about the wood. Clara, I don't care about the hay. I care that you are alive." Clara looked at him. She saw the man she loved standing in the ashes of his life, and he looked liberated. The fear of losing the ranch was gone because the ranch was effectively gone. All that was left was the truth. She reached into her pocket. The receipt was still there. "We have the horses," she said. "Yes," Eli said, "and we have the proof." Eli looked toward the town, invisible in the dark distance. "Tomorrow is the livestock auction," he said. "The whole town will be there. The judge, the sheriff, Rourke. They will be auctioning off the cattle they stole. Then we go to the auction." Clara said. She wiped her face. Her hand came away black with soot. She didn't wipe it off. She smeared it across her cheek like war paint. "We go," Eli said, "and we burn them down." The part ended with them standing in the orange glow, the fire roaring behind them, casting long shadows that stretched all the way to Oakhaven. They were ruined, they were exhausted, and they were terrifyingly free. The livestock auction in Oakhaven was the heartbeat of the local economy, a monthly ritual of noise, dust, and commerce, held in the wide corral behind the train depot. It was where prices were set, where neighbors judged one another's stock, and where the hierarchy of the valley was enforced. On this particular Wednesday, the air was crisp, the sky a piercing, indifferent blue. The corrals were full. Men in heavy coats sat on the top rails, smoking and spitting, while the auctioneer's voice rattled like a drum. In the center pen, a group of Hereford steers milled about, their breath steaming in the cold air. Vance Rourke stood by the gate, looking like a king surveying his subjects. He wore a fresh suit, his boots polished, a cigar clamped between his teeth. He was laughing with Judge Holloway and Deputy Miller. The auctioneer paused to take a breath. "And now, gentlemen, we have a fine lot of 50 head prime stock, courtesy of the double bar." The sound of hoofbeats cut through the drone of the crowd. Not the casual trot of a late arrival, but the hard, driving rhythm of horses ridden with purpose. Heads turned. The chatter died away. Clara Whitmore and Eli Barrett rode into the yard. They looked like apparitions rising from a battlefield. Their clothes were stained with soot and ash from the burning barn. Clara's face was smudged with black, making the whites of her eyes look startlingly bright. Eli rode beside her, his face a mask of grim determination, his rifle scabbard empty because the Winchester was resting across his saddle horn. They did not stop at the edge of the crowd. They rode straight through the center, the horses parting the sea of men like the prow of a ship. Clara reined Bess in right in front of the auctioneer's platform. She did not dismount. She sat high, looking down at Rourke. "Stop the sale," she said. Her voice was not a scream. It was a command, clear and ringing in the sudden silence. Rourke's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. "Well now," he said, pitching his voice for the crowd. "If it isn't the widow and her guardian angel, you two look like you have been playing in the fireplace." "We are here to return stolen property," Clara said. "Those cattle in the pen, they are not yours." A murmur ran through the crowd. Accusing a man of rustling in a public forum was a dangerous game. Rourke laughed, shaking his head. You are confused. Darlin', those are double-bar steers. Look at the brand. I know the brand. Clara said, I know you burned it over the Circle W and the Bar B, just like I know you burned down Eli's barn last night to try and stop us from coming here. The crowd shifted. The news of the fire hadn't reached town yet. Sheriff, Rourke barked, get this woman out of here. She is hysterical. She is disturbing the peace. Sheriff Brady stepped forward, looking uncomfortable. Now, Mrs. Whitmore, you best climb down and go home. You are making a scene. I am making a record, Clara said. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a sheaf of papers. She held them up. October 12th. She read loud enough for the back row to hear. 400 head shipped from this depot. Seller listed as double bar. Average weight, 600 pounds. She looked at the rancher nearest her. A man named Unsuspecting Jensen. Mr. Jensen. She said, you lost 50 yearlings in September, didn't you? You told me it broke you. Jensen nodded slowly, touching the brim of his hat. I did, ma'am. 600 pounds is the weight of a yearling. Clara said, not a steer. The double bar shipped your cattle, Mr. Jensen, and yours, Mr. Miller, and yours, Mr. Tate. She flipped the page. October 24th. She continued. The day my husband, Thomas Whitmore, died. A hush fell over the yard. The wind whipped the papers in her hand. Rourke stepped forward, his face flushing red. That is enough. You are slandering my name. I am naming your crimes. Clara shouted back. October 24th. A shipment of barbed wire signed for by Deputy Miller. She pointed a finger at the deputy, who was standing by the fence, looking like he wanted to vanish. Why was a lawman signing for ranch supplies? Clara asked. Because he was working for you, Rourke. He was on your payroll. And 4 hours later, you and he were at my fence line, threatening Thomas because he had found out about the shipments. Lies, Mrs. Gable shouted from the edge of the crowd. She stood with the other churchwomen, her face twisted in a sneer. Don't listen to her. Look at her. Look who she rides with, Mrs. Gable pointed a gloved finger at Eli. She is living in sin with a murderer, she shrieked. She sleeps in his bed. She has let her grief turn her into a whore for a gunslinger. How can you trust a word she says when she has no morals left? The insult hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She looked straight at Mrs. Gable. I sleep in a tack room, Clara said, her voice steady. And I ride with Eli Barrett because he is the only man in this valley who didn't turn his back when a widow was being robbed. You call me immoral because I am fighting for my home? You call me unstable because I refuse to let you bury the truth along with my husband? She turned back to the crowd, her eyes blazing. You want to talk about morals? Let us talk about the deed to my land. She pulled out the final piece of paper, the note from Thomas's coat. My husband didn't die of a heart attack. She said he was frightened to death. He was threatened by Rourke and the deputy. They told him if he didn't sell, they would burn us out. And when he collapsed, they watched him die. She looked at Rourke. You were there, she said. Thomas wrote it down. He wrote down the date, the time, and he wrote down that you offered the judge $500 to lose the survey map. The judge, standing on the platform, went pale. This is preposterous, Judge Halloway sputtered. I will hold you in contempt. Eli moved then. He didn't draw his gun. He simply nudged his horse forward, placing himself between Clara and the men on the ground. He rested his hands on the saddle horn, looking down at them with a gaze that was heavy with history. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence was a reminder of what happened when men were pushed too far. He was the barrier, the stone wall. The crowd was fracturing. The blind prejudice that had protected Rourke for so long was cracking under the weight of the specifics. Dates, weights, signatures. Men were looking at their boots, then at Rourke. You helped the wrong men, a voice said from the back. It was Jensen. He climbed down from the fence. If those weights match, he said, looking at Rourke, then you sold my stock. Rourke's eyes darted around the yard. He saw the shift. He saw the anger turning away from the widow and toward him. "Arrest them!" Rourke screamed at the sheriff. "They are armed. They are dangerous." Deputy Miller, panic rising in his eyes, drew his revolver. "Drop the gun!" "Barrett!" Miller yelled, his hands shaking. "Get down on the ground!" Eli didn't move. He looked at the deputy's gun barrel. "Put it away." "Miller," Eli said softly, "before you do something you can't undo." "I said drop it," Miller screamed, thumbing back the hammer. The tension snapped tight as a bowstring. The crowd scrambled back. This was the moment. The law was no longer a shield. It was a weapon in the hands of a frightened, corrupt man. "Stop!" The voice came from the depot platform. A man in a dark gray suit, carrying a leather satchel, walked down the stairs. He walked with the authority of someone who didn't answer to local judges. He stepped into the corral, ignoring the mud on his polished shoes. "I am Arthur Sterling," the man announced, "Regional Auditor for the Union Pacific Railroad." He walked up to Clara's horse. "May I see those logs, ma'am?" he asked. Clara handed them down. Sterling put on a pair of spectacles and scanned the pages. The silence in the yard was absolute. Even Miller lowered his gun slightly. Sterling looked up. He looked at the judge. He looked at Rourke. "These are accurate transcriptions of the company ledgers," Sterling said, "and they show a clear pattern of freight fraud. The weights listed here constitute a federal crime involving interstate commerce." He turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff Brady," Sterling said, his voice cold. "These records implicate the Double Bar Cattle Company in the transport of stolen goods across territorial lines. And they implicate your deputy in the falsification of receipts." The sheriff looked at Miller. He looked at Rourke, who was now sweating profusely. The sheriff had been a weak man, a man who looked the other way. But he was not a man who wanted to go to federal prison. He took a deep breath. He stepped toward his deputy. "Give me the gun, Miller," the sheriff said. Miller stared at him. "Sheriff, give it to me." The sheriff barked. "Now." Miller's hand wavered. For a second, Clara thought he might shoot. Eli shifted his weight, ready to launch himself from the saddle. Then Miller crumbled. The fight went out of him. He handed the gun to the sheriff. Sheriff Brady turned to Rourke. "Vance Rourke, you are under arrest," he said. Rourke didn't go quietly. He lunged for his own horse, trying to scramble into the saddle. Eli was faster. He spurred his horse forward, cutting Rourke off, forcing the foreman back against the fence. "It is over," Eli said. Rourke looked up at him, snarling. "This isn't justice. Barrett, it is just paperwork." "It is enough," Eli said. The victory was not a parade. It was a slow, grinding process of bureaucracy. In the weeks that followed, the town of Oak Haven was turned inside out. A circuit judge arrived to preside over the hearings. Rourke and Miller were held in the county jail. Judge Holloway resigned in disgrace and left on the midnight train. The Double Bar's assets were frozen. The stolen cattle were identified by brand and returned to their owners. Though many had already been sold, Clara got her land back. The deed was formally reinstated. The lien declared void due to fraud. Silas Prentice, the lawyer, managed to avoid jail by turning state's evidence, but his reputation was ruined. But it was not a clean sweep. Thomas was still dead. The restoration of the land didn't bring him back, and the town was slow to heal. There were no apologies. Mrs. Gable didn't come to Clara's door with a pie and a plea for forgiveness. The shopkeepers who had refused her credit simply nodded to her when she walked in, as if nothing had happened. They were ashamed, and shame made them quiet, not kind. The prejudice against Eli didn't vanish overnight. He was still the man with the dark past, but the venom was gone. The open insults stopped. When he rode down Main Street, men tipped their hats, not out of friendship, but out of respect. He had stood his ground. He had been right. In the West, being right was worth more than being liked. A month after the auction, Clara rode out to the Barrett Ranch. The snow was melting. Patches of brown earth were visible on the south slopes. The air smelled of mud and coming rain. The ranch was scarred. The black footprint of the burned barn was a wound in the yard. But the corrals were full of cattle, and the sound of hammering filled the air. Eli and his men were rebuilding. Eli was setting a corner post for the new barn when she rode in. He stopped and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. He walked over to her as she dismounted. He looked tired, but the shadow that had always haunted his eyes seemed lighter. "The sheriff says the trial starts in May. Clara said, I will have to testify." "We both will," Eli said. Clara looked at the charred remains of the old barn. "I am sorry about the fire. Eli, it was just wood. He said, we will build it back stronger. Stone foundation this time?" He looked at her, searching her face. "And your place?" he asked. "It is mine again." She said, "I walked the fence line yesterday. The house is cold, but it is standing. So you are going back?" He said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Clara looked at the ground. "I have to. It is Thomas's claim. It is what we fought for." Eli nodded. He took off his gloves, slapping them against his thigh. "You could stay," he said. Clara looked up. "I am not asking you to be my cook," Eli said. "And I am not asking you to be a guest." He gestured to the open land, the ridge line that separated his ranch from hers. "We could run the herds together," he said. "Combine the grazing rights. I have the water, you have the winter shelter. It makes sense. Is that a business proposition?" "Mr. Barrett?" Clara asked, a faint smile touching her lips. "Partly," Eli said. He stepped closer. The space between them was no longer charged with fear. It was warm, familiar. "I don't want to rescue you, Clara," he said softly. "You proved you don't need rescuing. You are the strongest woman I have ever known." He took her hand. His grip was rough, calloused, and real. "But I don't want to wake up in a house where you aren't. I don't want to ride the lines alone anymore." Clara felt the tears prick her eyes. It wasn't the flowery proposal of a storybook. It was a rancher's offer. Practical, honest, rooted in the earth. "I won't give up my name," she said. "I am Clara Whitmore, and I won't give up my claim." "Keep the name," Eli said. "Eli. Keep the claim. We will run it as a partnership. Equal shares." "And the town?" Clara asked. "They will talk. They will say I moved in with you before the mourning year was up." Eli looked toward the town, hidden behind the distant hills. Then he looked back at her, his gray eyes steady. "Let them talk," he said. "We have lived through their fire. Their words can't burn us now." Clara squeezed his hand. "Partners," she said. "Partners." Eli agreed. They stood together by the fence line as the sun began to set. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, stretching over a landscape that was harsh, unforgiving, and beautiful. The work ahead would be brutal. There were fences to mend, calves to birth, and a trial to endure. The double bar still had money, and money bought lawyers. The enemies were not all gone. They had just changed shape. But as Clara watched the light fade over the broken grasslands, she didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness that had defined her winter. She felt the solid presence of the man beside her. She saw the repaired wire stretching out into the distance, shining in the last light. It was a small thing, a thin line of metal against the wild, open world. But it held. They stood there, alive, marked by loss, but no longer alone. And in the silence of the high country, that was enough. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Clara and Eli through the harsh and beautiful landscape of the American West. It has been a pleasure to bring this tale of resilience and justice to life for you. I would love to hear where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and let me know which corner of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of the frontier. And finally, I would truly appreciate hearing your thoughts on the ending. Did justice find its way? Share your feelings in English in the comments. Safe travels, and see you on the trail.